Hello students, welcome to this lecture on the course Principles of Political Science. Today's lecture on interdisciplinary approach, political science and economics. In our previous two sessions, we explored the interdisciplinary relationship between political science and history in lecture 6 and between political science and sociology in lecture 7. In lecture 7, we saw how social structure such as caste, class, gender and religion shape political behavior, voting patterns, etc. Today we continue expanding our interdisciplinary understanding by exploring a third crucial connection between political science and economics. Economics and political science are perhaps the most naturally connected pairs of disciplines in the social sciences. Every political decision has economic consequences and every major economic development has political implications. Government decide how much to tax, how to spend public money, which industries to protect, and how to distribute resources across society. All of these are simultaneously economic and political acts. Understanding them fully requires knowledge of both disciplines. Here is the outline of today's lecture. We'll begin with the meaning of economics and as a discipline. We'll then examine the relationship between economics and political science and how each contribute to each other, what are the limitations and where the differences arise. We'll discuss key linking concepts, power and resources, public finance, development and the welfare state. Before we examine the relationship between political science and economics, we need to clearly understand what economics means as an economic discipline. The word economics comes from the ancient word oikos, meaning household, and nomos, meaning law or management. Together, the term originally referred to the management of a household. Over time, its meaning expanded to include the management of an entire nation's resources or the entire nation's economy. Modern economics is broadly defined as the study of how individuals, household, business and governments make decisions about the production, distribution and consumption of scarce resources. Since resources whether land, labor, capital or technology are limited and human wants are unlimited, economics examines how societies organize themselves to allocate these resources efficiently. We discussed in our previous lectures that politics is all about the conflict resolution over limited resources. Who gets what, how and when. So economics operates at two levels. Macroeconomics focuses on individual decision making by households and firms, examining how prices are determined, how markets function and how individuals agreed or how individual agents respond to incentives. Macroeconomics focuses on economics as a whole, studying national income, employment levels, inflation, economic growth and government fiscal and monetary policy. For students of political science, the macroeconomics economic level is most immediately relevant. Governments are responsible for managing the national economy through policies on taxation, public expenditure, trade and monetary regulation. Economics as a discipline has been shaped by a succession of influential thinkers whose ideas continue to influence both economic policy and political thought. Adam Smith, often called as the father of economics, published The Wealth of Nations in 1776. Smith argued that markets, when left free from excessive government interference, tend to allocate resources efficiently through what he described as the invisible hand of market competition. His ideas became the intellectual foundation of free market liberalism. David Ricardo, writing in the early 19th century, developed the theory of comparative advantage, which explains why nations benefit from specializing in producing goods at which they are relatively more efficient and trading with each other. This theory remains central to international trade policy and continues to influence trade negotiations today. Karl Marx offered a fundamentally different perspective. In Das Kapital, published in 1867, Marx argued that capitalism produces structural inequality through the exploitation of labor by capital. He predicted that capitalism would eventually collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. Marx's ideas inspired socialist, economic systems worldwide, including the economic policies of Soviet Union, and in modified form, early Indian economic planning also. Keynes, in the General Theory of 1936, argued that government must manage the economy through public spending, ideas that influence India's post-independence economic planning. One of the most fundamental observations connecting political science and economics is that political decisions directly shape economic policies. Governments are not neutral economic actors. They are political entities that reflect the interests, ideologies, and electoral compulsions of those who hold power. Understanding economic policy therefore requires understanding the political context in which it is made. Tax policy is one of the clearest examples. The decision about how much to tax citizens and corporations, what to tax, and who benefits from exemptions is not determined purely by economic logic. It is shaped by the political ideology of the ruling party, the pressure of the interest groups, the need to retain electoral support, and the demands of coalition partners. In India, the introduction of goods and services tax, that is GST, in 2017 was as much a political achievement as an economic reform, requiring years of negotiations between the central government and the state government with governments with different political leaderships. Trade policy provides another example. The decision to open markets to foreign competition or to protect domestic industries through tariff is always both an economic calculation as well as a political choice. After 1991, India's trade policy consistently reflected the tension between economic arguments for openness and political pressures from domestic industries, farmers, and trade unions. Just as political decisions shape economic policy, economic conditions powerfully influence political decisions and political outcomes. The state of the economy, whether growing or contracting, whether unemployment is high or low, whether prices are rising rapidly or remaining stable, has a direct and measurable impact on political stability, electoral outcomes, and government behavior. Economic hardship is one of the most consistent predictors of political instability and government change. When citizens experience rising unemployment, high inflation, or declining incomes, they tend to lose faith or confidence in the existing government and demand change. This relationship between economic performance and political outcomes is documented extensively in political science research and is sometimes called economic voting. The tendency of the voters to reward governments during good economic times and punish them during bad times. In India, economic conditions have played a significant role in electoral outcomes. The Congress-led UPA's second term from 2009 to 2014 was marked by high inflation, slowing economic growth, and major corruption scandals. These economic and governance failures contributed significantly to the decisive defeat of the Congress in 2014 general elections. Economic crisis can also produce fundamental political change. The Great Depression of the 1930s discredited laissez-faire economics and brought interventionist government to power across the world. One of the most important contributions of economics to political science is its analytical framework for understanding public policy. Public policy refers to the decisions and actions of governments aimed at addressing social problems and achieving collective goals. Economics provides the tool to design, evaluate, and improve these policies systematically. Cost benefit analysis, one of the most widely used tools in economics, help policymakers assess whether a proposed policy is worth implementing by comparing its expected benefits to its cost in monetary terms. Political science on its own might recommend a policy based on normative or ideological grounds. Economics adds the discipline of quantitative assessment, asking not just whether a policy is desirable in principles, but whether it is efficient and affordable in practice, of course, economically. The concept of market failure is another key economic contribution to policy analysis. Markets sometimes fail to produce efficient outcomes or the desired results on their own because of externalities, public goods, information asymmetries, or monopoly power. In each of these cases, economics provides the theoretical justification for governmental intervention. When private firms pollute the environment, imposing costs on society that they do not pay for, this is a negative externality, economic concept that justifies environmental regulation and environmental taxation both domestically and globally. Globally also, the developing world is asking to bear the economic burden of climate change or protecting the environment. Economics makes a second major contribution to political science through its analysis of government budget, taxation, and welfare policies. The government budget is the most powerful instrument of economic policy. It reflects political priorities, what a government chooses to fund and what it chooses not to fund, reveals more about its values rather than any political speech. Public finance is the branch of economics that studies government revenue, government expenditure, and management of public debt. It examines how governments raise money through taxes, fees, and borrowings, and how they spend the money on public goods and services such as defense, education, healthcare, infrastructure, and social welfare. Taxation is both an economic policy and a political act. The structure of a tax system, whether it relies more on income tax, corporate taxes, consumption taxes, or property taxes, determines who bears the burden of funding government. Progressive taxation, where higher earners pay a larger share of their income, is associated with redistributive political goals. Regressive taxation, where lower earners pay a proportionately higher burden, tends to favor those with greater economic power. Welfare policies such as food subsidies, unemployment benefits with greater benefits, healthcare schemes, and pension programs represent the political commitment of our government to the well-being of people or its citizens. A third major contribution of economics to political science is the insight that economic conditions are powerful determinants of political stability. Political science has long recognized that states can be destabilized by military threats, ethnic conflicts, or weak institutions. Economics adds a crucial the crucial insight that economic failures, persistent poverty, unemployment, inequality, and inflation can be equally destabilizing. The relationship between poverty and political instability has been extensively documented. Countries with high levels of poverty and inequality tend to experience high rates of political violence, civil conflict, and government breakdown. Economists and political scientists have found that economic deprivation creates conditions in which extremist political movements thrive. social trust erodes, and democratic institutions become vulnerable. In the Indian context, economic underdevelopment and inequality have contributed to regional political movements demanding greater autonomy, and in some cases to insurgencies also. The Naxalite movement, which has operated in the forested and tribal regions of center and eastern India for decades, draws much of its political energy from the severe economic deprivation, landlessness and displacement experienced by tribal and forest dwelling communities in those regions. But equally important is the role of the communist political ideology that encouraged or that provided that political environment to economic deprivations to be transformed into a violent movement called Naxalism. Now recently, Government of India, after the surrender of a large number of Naxalite activists, is rehabilitating them by bringing them into productive economic employment, where they are learning the skills so that they can be self-reliant and other kinds of skills so that they can be economically independent and they do not turn to violence for their survival. When prices rise sharply and quickly, ordinary citizens find their purchasing power declining and government faces intense political pressure. The relationship between political science and economics is not one directed just as economics contributes to political science. Political science makes important contribution to economics by explaining how governments shape economic life. First and the most fundamental contribution is political science's analysis of the role of government in economic planning. Markets do not operate in vacuum or in political vacuum. They function within legal frameworks created by governments, regulated by institutions, established through political processes, and are fundamentally shaped by the distribution of political power within a society. Political science examines these political foundations of economic system and shows that what we call the economy is always in part a product of political actions or political choices. The role of the state in economic planning has been one of the most debated questions in the history of both economics and political science. In the Indian context, the answer given at independence was emphatic. The architects of economic policy, particularly Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, who was highly influenced by socialist ideology, and his principal economic advisor P.C. Mahalanobis, were committed to a model of planned economic development in which the state would take the leading role. Both the public and the private enterprises coexisted, and we opted for a mixed economies. India's 5-year plans were launched in 1951 under the Planning Commission, represented the most ambitious experiments in state-directed economic development in a democratic country. The second major contribution of political science in economics is its analysis of how political institutions, political processes, and political actors shape economic policy making and economic regulations. Economics, particularly in its more formal theoretical version, tends to model policy making as though it were carried out by a rational, benevolent social planner who simply maximizes social welfare. Political science corrects the idealization by showing that policy making is actually a competitive, conflict-ridden process involving multiple actors with different interests. The field of public choice theory, associated with the Nobel Prize winning economist James Buchanan, built a bridge between economics and political science by applying economic reasoning to political behavior. Buchanan argued that politicians, bureaucrats, and voters are like rational, self-interested individuals in the political sphere, just as they do in economic sphere. Politicians seek to win elections, bureaucrats seek to expand their departments, and interest groups seek to extend their influence and thus extend their influence and thus extract benefits from the government. Understanding this practical logic of economic policy making is essential for explaining why governments sometimes adopt economically suboptimal policies. Regulatory policy is another area where political science makes a crucial contribution to economics. Governments regulate markets in areas ranging from banking and finance to telecommunications, pharmaceuticals, and food safety. Among the key concepts that connect political science and economics, the relationship between power and resources is perhaps the most fundamental. Power and resources are interdependent. Those who control economic resources tend to accumulate political power, and those who hold political power can shape the distribution of economic resources. This crucial relationship between economic and political power is a central theme in political economy, the interdisciplinary field that combines insights from both the disciplines. Political economy as a field has a long history. Classical political economists like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, and Karl Marx all studied the relationship between economic activity and political power without drawing a sharp distinction between the two disciplines. The artificial separation of economics and political science into distinct academic disciplines occurred mainly in the late 19th and early 20th century. Political economy as an interdisciplinary field represents an attempt to restore their natural connection. In the Indian context, the relationship between economic resources and political power is clearly visible. Wealthy industries and business houses have historically had significant influence over political parties through political donations, media ownerships, and personal connections with political leaders. Conversely, political connections provide businesses with access to license, quota, contracts, land, and regulatory favors. Two further concepts linking political science and economics deserve careful examination is public finance and development. Both concepts are simultaneously economic and political, and understanding them fully requires the analytical tools of both disciplines working together. Public finance refers to the management of government's revenue, expenditure, and debt. From an economic perspective, public finance is about efficiency, how government can raise revenue and allocate expenditures in ways that minimizes distortions and maximizes social welfare. From a political perspective, public finance is about power and priorities whose interests are reflected in the budget, who bears the tax burden, and who benefits from public expenditure. In India, the annual union budget presented by the finance minister to parliament is simultaneously an economic document and a major political event. The budget announces tax changes, allocates funds to various ministries and programs, sets targets for economic growth and fiscal deficit, and signals the government's priorities for the coming year. Political parties, business associations, farmers' organizations, trade unions, and civil society groups all seek to influence the budget in favor of their constituencies. The budget thus represents the intersection of economic logic and political power in its most concentrated and visible form. A third important linking concept is the welfare state, a concept that sits at the intersection of political philosophy, political science, and economics. A welfare state is a political and economic system in which government undertake to protect the health, education, employment, and social security of its citizens, primarily through public provisions of services and social transfer programs. The welfare state emerged as a political response to the economic and social disruptions produced by industrial capitalism. As industrialization created new forms of insecurity like unemployment, occupational illness, old age without family support, political movements emerged demanding that the state take responsibilities for protecting citizens against these risks. In Western Europe, the most comprehensive welfare states developed after the Second World War, influenced by Keynesian economics, social democratic politics, and the desire to prevent the conditions of deprivation that had contributed to the rise of fascism in India. The welfare state model has taken a and the desire to prevent the conditions of deprivations. In India, the welfare state model has taken a distinctive form or a form shaped by the country's specific historical. In India, the welfare state model has taken a distinctive form shaped by the country's specific historical, economic, and political conditions. The Indian Constitution, through directive principles of state policy, committed to state to securing living wages, providing educational opportunities, promoting public health, and protecting workers. It's a plan to create a welfare state. These are not legally enforceable rights, but are declared principles that are meant to guide legislation and policy. The Union Budget of India is one of the most powerful examples of how political science and economics intersect in practice, and it provides an ideal case study for understanding the interdisciplinary relationship between the two disciplines. The budget is presented annually by the finance minister in parliament, typically on the first day of February. It sets out the government's revenue estimates and expenditure plans for the coming financial year, and is the single most important policy document produced by the government. From an economic perspective, the union budget is a macroeconomic instrument. It determines the fiscal deficit, the difference between the government's total income and expenditure, or the total revenue and its expenditure, which has direct implications for inflation, interest rates, and economic growth. The budget also sets priorities for public investments in infrastructure, agriculture, education, healthcare, and social welfare. Economists evaluate the budget by asking whether it allocates resources efficiently, whether it is fiscally responsible, and whether it addresses the country's most pressing economic challenges. From a political perspective, the union budget is a statement of political priorities and a tool of electoral strategy. Governments often increase spendings on popular welfare programs before elections and reduce spendings in the first year of a new term. India's poverty alleviation program represents another rich example of the intersection of economics and politics. Since independence, successive governments have launched numerous schemes aimed at reducing poverty, expanding access to food, generating rural employment, and improving the living standards of the most vulnerable sections of the population. Understanding these programs requires both economic analysis and political analysis simultaneously. From an economic perspective, poverty alleviation requires identifying the causes of poverty, whether they lie in lack of assets, inadequate employment, poor education, or barriers to credit and markets, and designing interventions that address those root causes efficiently. Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize winning economist from India, emphasized in his capability approach that poverty is not merely a matter of low incomes but the deprivation of fundamental human capabilities such as health, education, and participation in social life. From a political perspective, poverty alleviation programs serve multiple purposes. They address genuine human needs, but they also build political support among the poor, who constitute a large majority of India's electorate. The Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act of 2005 is one such scheme to catering to the needy and the poor. India's economic reforms of 1991 represent perhaps the most dramatic examples in Indian history of how economic crisis and political decision-making interact. Understanding the reforms require knowing both the economic conditions that made them necessary and the political processes through which they were implemented. The economic background was one of severe crisis. By mid-1991, India's foreign exchange reserves had fallen to levels sufficient to cover only about 3 weeks of import. The country was on the verge of defaulting on its international debt obligations. The balance of payment crisis was on the verge of, the balance of payments crisis was the immediate economic trigger for the reforms. The political background was equally complex. The government that implemented the reforms was a minority Congress government led by Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao, which came to power following the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi in 1990 during the 1991 election campaigns. Despite its political weakness, the government moved decisively. Finance Minister Manmohan Singh presented a reformist budget in July 1991 that devalued the rupees, reduced import licensing, lowered tariffs, and initiated the dismantling of license Raj. The 1991 reforms involved three key sets of changes. Liberalization, which reduced government's control on private enterprises; privatization, which opened previously public sector dominated areas or industries to private competition; and globalization, which opened the Indian economy to foreign trade and foreign direct investment. Having explored the contribution of each discipline, we can now compare both and their differences. While the two disciplines are deeply connected, they have distinct focuses, methods, and fundamental assumptions that makes them separate and identifiable fields of academic inquiry. The most fundamental difference is their primary subject matter. Economics focuses on the economy, production, distribution, consumption of scarce resources by individual firms and governments. Its core question is how scarce resources are allocated to satisfy unlimited human wants most efficiently. Political science focuses on state and political power, governance, authority, legitimacy, and the process through which collective decisions are made. Its core questions we have already discussed, that who gets what, when, and how in the political sphere. The second difference is that of methodology. Modern economics relies heavily on mathematical modeling, quantitative data, and formal analytical understanding or analytical tools like game theory, econometrics, and statistical interference. Political science uses a broader range of methods, including qualitative case studies, historical analysis, institutional analysis, and survey-based research. However, both disciplines have moved forward towards more towards using quantitative methods in recent decades. The third difference relates to fundamental assumptions. The interdisciplinary relationship between the two subjects, while enormously productive, also has limitation. The first limitation is the problem of assuming that economic actors behave rationally and that political actors distort economic efficiency. This assumption, common in neoclassical economics and in some versions of public choice theory, leads to a bias in which government intervention is always seen as a problem and markets are seen as the natural solution. This ignores the many situations in which markets fail and governments succeed. The second limitation is that of methodological imperialism. Economics tries to explain all political phenomena using economic models and assumptions. So the methodological imperialism occurs. The rational choice approach in political science, which applies economic reasoning to political behavior, has been criticized for oversimplifying the motivations of political actors. Not all political behavior can be explained by rational self-interest, values, ideology, identity, and emotions are they also matter powerfully. The third limitation is the neglect of power. Mainstream economics often treats the distribution of resources as the outcome of voluntary market transactions between equal agents. It tends to ignore the political power relations that determine the starting distribution of assets and the rules of the market itself. The relation between the two disciplines has never been relevant than it is today. Three contemporary issues demonstrate this with particular clarity: globalization, economic inequality, and the challenge of evidence-based policy making. Globalization refers to the increasing integration of national economics or economies through trade, investment, migration, and the movement of ideas and technology across borders. It is simultaneously an economic phenomenon and a deeply political one. From an economic perspective, globalization has expanded markets, increased efficiency, and contributed to economic growth in many countries. From a political perspective, it has created winners and losers within the country, generating political pressures for protection, redistribution, and sovereign control over economic policy. The economic inequality has emerged as one of the most politically charged issues of the 21st century. The Oxfam India reports of 2023 highlighted that top 1% of India's population held 58% of the country's total wealth. Well, we have now completed lecture 8. Let us bring together the key ideas. Today we added the economic dimension to our growing interdisciplinary framework. We defined economics as the study of how scarce resources are produced, distributed, and consumed, and traced its development through thinkers like Adam Smith, Karl Marx, and Keynes. So we established the two-way relationship between economics and political science, or economics and politics. Political decisions shape economic policies, while economic conditions profoundly influence political stability and electoral outcomes. We examined how economics contributes to political science through frameworks of public policy analysis, understanding government budget, taxation, welfare, and through its insights into the economic determinants of political stability. We saw how political science contributes to economics by explaining government's role in economic planning and by analyzing the political processes that shape economic regulation and policy making. We discussed key linking concepts: power and resources, public finance, development, and the welfare state, all, and eliminated them through Indian examples: the union budget, poverty alleviation program, and the transformative reforms of 91. Thank you.